Today's video is sponsored by Picker's Grip. Stop dropped picks and pick rotation while playing with Picker's Grip. Made with all natural ingredients in Virginia. Check out their website to order. When you support my sponsor, this also supports my channel, and it's very much appreciated. Today on Robert's Guitar Dungeon, we're talking about 13 guitar gear myths. 13, that's 13, well, I guess that's like that. That many plus 3 more. As a guitar player, you can ask the exact same question to 10 different people and get 10 different answers. So sometimes it is very, very difficult to figure out what exactly the truth might be. Some of these myths that I'm talking about here today don't have a lick of truth to them. Some of them have maybe a little bit of some truth to it, and there's a few in here that I do tend to believe. Whatever the case, every one of these makes for a good conversation piece. So let's get to it. Number 1, true bypass pedals make for better guitar tone. I don't think there is another myth in the guitar industry that is more widely spread than this one. True bypass allows your guitar signal to continue to pass through the pedal even when it is in bypass mode and not even being powered. Therefore, if you have a power issue or something like that, as long as the pedal is still connected on either side, your guitar signal will still pass through it. The problem with doing that is the equivalent to adding about another foot of cable to your guitar signal. So if you have 12 pedals on your board and they're all true bypass, when they're in bypass mode, you are essentially adding another 12 feet of cable, roughly. And more importantly, the longer your cable, the farther your signal has to travel. And when that happens, the high end of your signal begins to roll off. That is the advantage to a buffered bypass. Buffered bypasses will boost that signal back up. The truth is, the best way to manage your signal going through all of your pedals on your pedal board is to have a good mixture of true bypass and buffered bypass. Most pro pedal boards out there will even have a Boss pedal on there someplace, if just for the buffered bypass that it contains, if nothing else. So if you want your guitar tone preserved as best as it possibly can be from the beginning of your effects chain all the way to the end, if at all possible, go for a mixture of both. If all your pedals do happen to be true bypass, companies nowadays, such as TC Electronic and JHS, are actually making little buffer boxes that you can stick at the end of your pedal chain to buffer it back up. Number 2, pedals with top-mounted jacks are better. Fellow YouTube creator Sean Pierce Johnson actually brought this up on a guitar group on Facebook this week, and a number of other YouTube creators, myself included, all happened to chime in. And the point that he was making, I think the exact post was, top-mounted jacks does not a better pedal make. And most of us tend to agree with him. A lot of pedal companies nowadays are coming up with pedal designs that include top-mounted jacks. I don't necessarily believe that they're doing that because it makes for a better pedal. I believe that they are doing that because that is growing in popularity, and right now that is one more added selling point. The reason why a lot of people like top-mounted jacks is because theoretically you can put another pedal with top-mounted jacks right next to it, and even one on either side, and conserve real estate on your pedal board. The reason why that is not exactly a foolproof theory is because if the pedal on either side of it does not have top-mounted jacks, you gain nothing. In fact, oftentimes that is even more difficult to work with, because then you have to run a cable from the top of one pedal over to the side of another, oftentimes twisting the cable, making it more susceptible to shorting out, etc., etc., etc. So the only instance, in my opinion, where top-mounted jacks are an advantage is, again, if the pedal on either side of it on your board is also a pedal with top-mounted jacks. And one more point about top-mounted jacks, I have yet to play a pedal that where the jacks were mounted on the pedal made any difference whatsoever about how it sounded. Number 3, Pete Townsend is responsible for the full stack. This is a story that I tend to believe because I've heard it so many times over the years. The story goes that after many years of Pete Townsend playing through a 212 cabinet, Jim Marshall built him his first 412. And Pete Townsend loved it so much because it was moving so much more air and it was such a bigger sound that Pete Townsend went into Jim Marshall's shop one day and said, I want you to build me an 812 cabinet. To which Jim Marshall responded, well, Pete, that's great, but if we build that for you, you're not going to be able to lift it. I mean, that's crazy. Pete said, I don't care, build it. So Jim Marshall says, okay, and builds him, sure enough, an 812 cabinet. Out on the road, Pete goes with it. About a month later, Pete comes dragging that 812 cabinet back into Jim Marshall's shop, looking absolutely exhausted, and said, can you cut this in half for me? Lo and behold, that is how the full stack was born. To my knowledge, that story is absolutely true, even though I have never heard Pete Townsend confirm it in an interview or anything. The reason why I am calling this a myth is because I have heard that same story told numerous times over the years with a different cast of characters, including Jimi Hendrix and Brian May and several others. Pete Townsend is the version that I am the most familiar with, and that is the one that I tend to believe. And especially knowing how Pete was and how he performed back in those days, smashing guitars and everything, it makes the most sense to me. Number 4, high-end cables are better than cheap cables. In a lot of cases, this is true. However, at the end of the day, a guitar cable is still shielded copper wire. And whether it's a cheap cable or it's an expensive cable, at the end of the day, you still got shielded copper wire. That is the makings of a guitar cable. Now, I'm no scientist, but I do remember the periodic table from grade school. And copper is a metal element, meaning it is already in its simplest, purest form, meaning there cannot be any other additives or ingredients or anything mixed in with it, to the best of my knowledge. The reason why I believe that more expensive cables perform better is because of the construction, particularly as it relates to the ends, the cable jacks and stuff, and how those are soldered on, or in the case of non-solderless cables, how they are installed onto the end of the cable itself, and as it relates to durability. If you have a cable that doesn't provide a very good connection, then obviously you're going to run into signal problems. I personally do use high-end cables because I do happen to like the build quality. However, I will use more economy cables in my shorter cable runs, such as on my pedal board, to save cost, if for no other reason. Not always, but a lot of times. That said, I've always got a set of backup cables in my bag with me whenever I'm playing out, and those backup cables are a set of Roadhog, cheap Roadhog cables, 20-foot cables that I have had for over 10 years that have never had a problem with, and I think cost me about 12 bucks a piece. And they've all, if I've ever had to go to them, they've always worked fine. Do higher end cables produce a clearer signal? A lot of players out there seem to say yes, and I don't necessarily disagree with them. What I do tend to question is why. Is it because of the cable itself, or is it because of the way that it's built? Number 5. Metal bands always play with a lot of gain. False. If you listen to Megadeth's Rust in Peace record, and as you listen to it, listen closely and to just the guitar tone by itself. I think you would be very surprised to find out that Dave Mustaine does not crank up his gain very much at all. And that's just one example. Slayer's Seasons in the Abyss record would be another example, and both of those are two of the biggest metal bands of all time. And there's a long list of other bands that don't use quite as much gain as we like to think that they do. The reason why we think that is because they do use gain. It's not like they're playing through a clean sound. They do use gain, but it sits in exactly the right place in the mix, combined with their aggressive style of playing. That's what gives us heavy metal. It's not cranked up gain knobs, and it certainly isn't scooped out mids. Which leads me to my next point, number 6. More gain equals heavier tone. Again, not necessarily the case. Let me show you why. I recently have started playing with a lot less gain myself, just as an experiment, and what I have discovered is that playing with less gain actually forces me to play better. And the reason why is because I can all of a sudden hear the articulation of my picking a lot better, as well as the percussiveness, and every single note is a lot clearer and stands out a lot more than it does with the gain cranked all the way up. In this particular setting, the gain is set to a little past 3 o'clock, almost all the way up. Now let's try those exact same couple of riffs, but this time I'm going to turn the gain down to somewhere between about 8 and 9 o'clock. Hence the point that I'm trying to make. Metal bands don't necessarily want more gain. They want tighter tone that sits exactly the right place in the mix with more precision, more articulation, and most important, more aggression. Number 7, the player's tone is all in his hands. Sometimes. If you were not aware, both Joe Satriani and Steve Vai played on Alice Cooper's Feed My Frankenstein. Matter of fact, they split the solo. And I may be a little bit biased about this because I am a huge Steve Vai fan and I am very familiar with his playing and what he sounds like. But when you're listening to Feed My Frankenstein, I can tell you exactly on that record where Steve Vai's playing begins and where it ends, because it sounds exactly like Steve Vai. And the reason why it sounds exactly like Steve Vai is because Steve Vai's hands belong only to him. However, there have been plenty of other great guitar players who have been mimicked time and time and time again. If you walk into pretty much any guitar store in the country, eventually you're going to find a young kid who has been very heavily inspired by Stevie Ray Vaughan and is sitting down playing a Strat through a Fender twin reverb. And the Strat's set up on the middle pickup and he's playing Stevie Ray Vaughan riffs and he sounds just like Stevie Ray Vaughan. Yet we know it's not Stevie Ray Vaughan. Now, nothing against Stevie Ray Vaughan. I think he's one of the most influential guitar players ever. But when it comes to his own personal sound, yes, he wrote the songs, but there have been lots of other people that could sit down and play it and sound just like him. Therefore, I believe the one reason why Stevie Ray Vaughan sounded the way that he did was because of the gear that he used. And he was very, very knowledgeable about gear and he knew how to use it. You know, he's one of the first people, if not the first person that I know of, that used a tube screamer overdrive and cranked the level and turned the gain all the way down. You know, to my knowledge, that was a SRV trick to get that SRV tone. And there's nothing wrong with that, to be clear. You know, Stevie Ray Vaughan's a great player. Steve Vai is a great player. But you know, there's that handful of people out there that I can tell it's them playing just because I can tell by the playing style. You know, Zakk Wylde's another one. Yngwie's is another one of those guys. You know, those people, I can tell it's them. Just, you know, Derek Trucks has a very, very unique sound that comes from his hands. You know, those people, I can tell it's them just by the sound and the style of the playing. And there's a lot of other people out there that sound like them because of the gear that they used and the way that they used it. You know, those sounds seem to be replicated. Talent, not necessarily. Tone, I believe so. Number 8, vintage gear sounds better. I don't buy that at all. Vintage gear certainly has its place, and even if you take the collectability aspect out of it, you know, even, you know, tone-wise, it certainly has its place. You know, the Kenny Wayne Shepherds and the Eric Johnsons and you know, lots of those players, you know, that really just like the sound of that old, you know, those old vintage guitar tones. You know, the Black Keys took it to an entirely different level, and they've recorded entire albums on vintage recording gear. And when they're done recording the record, it sounds like it was recorded in 1950 something. You know, it has its place. That said, there is a reason why Zoltan Bathory and Jason Hook from Five Finger Death Punch are not playing vintage strats through a 65 Deluxe Reverb. There is a reason why they play modern gear. The modern gear that they use, is a big reason why they sound the way that they sound. And if you took that exact same band and started running them all through vintage gear, everything else stays the same, the playing, the songwriting and everything, it just wouldn't have the same feel to it. And I don't believe that they would have the same connection with their fan base that they do, because they just wouldn't be able to get that type of sound out of that old vintage gear. It's not made for that. That's what modern gear is for. Gear progresses over time. The idea that just because it's old means it's better is absolutely ridiculous. Number 9, playing in lower tunings produces a heavier sound. I actually did a video on this a couple of years ago, and that video was inspired by videos that were put up prior to that by Fluff and Rob Scallon. And Rob Scallon actually did a video that was very effective in playing the exact same song, riff on the same guitar and everything, tuning a half step down at a time. So I decided to conduct my own experiment in my own video, and what I found is you got the exact same riff that didn't change one single solitary tiny little bit other than the key it was being played in, which just dropped down a half step at a time. Especially metal bands that have lead singers with really low, deep, guttural, oftentimes growling voices, playing in lower tunings allows those lead vocalists to be able to hit their vocal range a lot easier. However, if you're one of those bands that tunes way, way, way down, there does come a point when you've tuned down too far. When you get down too low, guitar tuners do not pick up the low strings nearly as accurately as they would if they were in a more traditional tuning. And when that happens, it makes it much harder for them to get those strings in tune as well as to stay in tune. And more importantly than that, when you're getting down there into that register, you're also beginning to step on the bass player's toes, and you are way out of where you really should be in the mix. Tuning down to a point is cool, especially if there's a reason for it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make you sound heavier. Number 10, heavier strings makes for a fatter tone. If you take the Stevie Ray Vaughan side of that argument, there might be some truth to that, because Stevie Ray Vaughan played 13 gauge strings throughout most of his career. And the only reason why he played 13 gauge strings is because his guitar techs had to talk him down, because he originally started out playing 17 gauge strings. But his guitar techs had to talk him down from 17s because 17 gauge strings just put way too much tension on the necks and it was ruining his guitars. So finally they compromised and he started playing 13s because he really, really liked the tone of them. Lots of other guitar players with fantastic, wonderful guitar tone play very light gauge strings. Steve Vai plays 9s, Carlos Santana plays 9s, Eddie Van Halen plays 9s, Brian May plays 9s, Billy Gibbons plays 8s. So while I do agree that you do get a different tone from playing heavier strings, does that tone necessarily sound fatter or better? Very subjective, of course, and the answer in this case, of course, is in the ear of the beholder. I see both sides of this argument, and I don't think anybody's wrong. Number 11, hand-wired amps are better than PCBs. PCB standing, of course, for painted circuit boards. Nope, not buying it at all. If you're buying a hand-wired Marshall, most of what you're paying for is the labor, because somebody obviously went through and soldered every single point by hand. That being said, the year Marshall switched over from hand-wired to PCBs in 1974, I believe, and which means they would have been well into PCB era in the 1980s, and the JCM 800 is one of the most fantastic guitar tones I've ever heard, as is, and you all know how much I love my JCM 900 sitting right behind me, as well as the Panama amps, the Randall amps, and everything that I have in this room are all PCB boards, as well as Mesa Boogies and Fryette and Bogner and Friedman and lots of other high-end amp companies that all use PCB boards. Hand-wired amps are purely a myth. I've never played a hand-wired amp that I just absolutely fell in love with and had to have. and strictly because it was a hand-wired amp and just produced this magnificent tone because of it. Again, there's something to be said for hand-wired amps, particularly from a vintage nostalgia point of view. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. But again, nowadays, if you're buying a hand-wired amp, a large portion of that price tag is all in labor. Number 12, analog delay is better than digital delay. This is another one that I don't buy into at all, and the reason being is because I think that they produce two totally different sounds. In the instance, there's always going to be a real big analog versus digital argument throughout the entire music industry. I decided to focus this particular one down to just the delay pedal. And as I mentioned Joe Satriani before, when Joe Satriani released Surfing with the Alien, he had these amazing delay tones all over, in several places on that record. And the entire world was shocked to find out that it was a little bitty, teeny tiny pink stomp box that happened to be what we now know is an Ibanez 89 analog delay. To his credit, I believe that's probably the reason why that pedal is worth as much as it is on the vintage market today. That said, it produces a very specific tone. Digital delay, on the other hand, also produces a very specific tone, and the tone that analog delay produces is dirtier and and a lot warmer, whereas digital delay is very, very clean and very crisp and very accurate. I happen to be a digital delay guy myself. My Boss DD7 is my very, very favorite delay pedal and one of my very favorite pedals of all time. That being said, digital, analog being better than digital, or even vice versa, I think whichever side of that fence you land on, I think one being better than the other is like arguing Ford and Chevy. I think it's just a matter of what your preference is, and they both have very specific uses. I will say nowadays with the Strymons and Boss and these great big giant digital delay pedals, they got 3 and 4 switches and tap tempo and all of these presets and all these different kinds of crazy features. That would not be possible without digital. Number 13, beginning guitarists should always start out with an acoustic guitar. When I was working at a guitar store, particularly around the holiday season, this is the myth that I had to debunk more often than any other. For some reason, parents and people that do not have any musical instrument experience whatsoever, and I don't know where this myth started, but for some reason they think that acoustic guitar is where guitar players start. And what I always have to explain to them is acoustic guitar and electric guitar are not the same instrument. If you have a child who is into Taylor Swift and the Beatles and things like maybe Dave Matthews and things like that, acoustic guitar might be a good place to start. But if you have a child who wants to learn to play guitar and he's into Green Day and Foo Fighters and Metallica, and putting an acoustic guitar in that child's hands is going to break that child's heart. When I first wanted to learn to play guitar, I was inspired by my father, who was an acoustic guitar player. However, my father and I have never had the same musical interests, and not once when I was that age did I ever want to own an acoustic guitar. I wanted an electric guitar because I wanted to be like the guys in Metallica and Motley Crue and Iron Maiden. Those are the guitar players that I was into, and if you had handed me an acoustic guitar and told me, here you go, learn to play this before you get to go sound like those guys, it would have been the most deflating thing that you possibly could have told me. And it most likely would have discouraged me from wanting to learn the instrument. The correct answer to what kind of guitar a beginning guitar player should start out on is the one that interests them. And another part of me thinks that a lot of parents like to buy their kids their first guitar and get them an acoustic just because it's cheaper and they don't have to worry about buying an amplifier with it, which as many options as there are out there nowadays, that shouldn't even be an issue anymore either. That's all for this list. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what your favorite guitar myth is and whether or not you believe it or whether or not you think it's complete crap. If you enjoyed this video, also please consider hitting the subscribe button. I put up videos like this as well as all different kinds of gear demos and stuff all the time, and would certainly love to have you come back and check out some more of that stuff and become part of the family. So hit the subscribe button, and while you're at it, hit that little bell icon button right next to it so you get alerts and don't miss out on anything that might be coming your way. Another great way to support this channel is by checking out my merch shop on Teespring, which you will see in a card right here above my head. When you get there to that there merch shop, you can get pretty cool and goofy guitar gear related t-shirts like this one. And who doesn't love guitar t-shirts, right? Everybody loves guitar t-shirts, especially if you're a guitar player. So, as always, links down in the description, t-shirts, subscribe, comment. See you next time. You know what? There are tons of young people out there that want to get involved in music and do not have the means to do so. If you are watching this video, most likely you're a musician, and many experienced musicians have tons of broken and unwanted gear lying around that they're not doing anything with. Please visit my friends at Share the Music on Facebook at the link below and learn how you and your unwanted gear can help change somebody's life.